November 20th, 1980. A 10-foot deep freshwater lake in southern Louisiana. Quiet. Still. A few fishermen on the shore. And floating right in the middle of it, a 150-foot tall oil drilling rig, $5 million of steel and machinery, punching a 14-inch hole straight down through the lake bed. 1,200 feet below that rig, 55 men were at work inside a salt mine. Tunnels 100 feet wide. Ceilings 80 feet high. A subterranean cathedral carved out of solid rock salt, stretching down 1,500 feet into the earth. Nobody on that drilling platform knew the mine was directly beneath them. And nobody in that mine knew a drill bit was chewing straight toward their ceiling. By noon, the lake would be gone. Every single drop, 3.5 billion gallons of water, swallowed into the earth in under 3 hours. The rig would vanish. 11 cargo barges would be sucked beneath the surface. A 12-mile canal would reverse direction, dragging the Gulf of Mexico backward into the crater, generating a 164-foot waterfall and 400-foot geysers of compressed air and mud. And somehow, every single human being survived. But the story doesn't end with the disaster, because decades later, engineers looked at the crater that swallowed everything and decided to fill it with billions of cubic feet of explosive natural gas. On purpose. To understand how a shallow fishing lake swallowed itself, you need to understand what's underneath Louisiana. Buried beneath the Gulf Coast are at least 128 massive columns of solid salt, called salt domes. These formations are remnants of an ancient sea that covered the region roughly 150 million years ago. When that sea evaporated, it left behind unimaginable quantities of crystallized salt. Over millions of years, the weight of sediment piling on top squeezed that salt layer under enormous pressure. And salt, under enough pressure, behaves like a thick fluid. It flows. It pushes upward through cracks and weak points in the rock above, rising toward the surface in slow-motion towers of solid halite. Some of these domes stretch 5 miles wide and plunge 10,000 feet deep. Underground mountains of pure salt hidden beneath bayous and farm fields and shallow lakes. Lake Peigneur sat directly on top of one of them. The Jefferson Island Salt Dome was the northernmost of a chain called the Five Islands. Underground formations so massive their tops actually bulged the surface upward, creating small hills in an otherwise pancake-flat coastal plain. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company had been mining this dome since 1919, carving out a sprawling multi-level complex using the room and pillar method. Imagine hollowing out an enormous underground parking garage, but instead of concrete columns holding up the ceiling, you leave behind pillars of unmined salt, each one bearing the full crushing weight of everything above it. Now here's the critical piece of chemistry that turned a drilling accident into an apocalypse. Rock salt can hold up an 80-foot ceiling. It can support millions of tons of earth pressing down from above, but expose it to fresh water and it dissolves. Fast. Not over years, over minutes. That vulnerability sat like a loaded weapon beneath every acre of Lake Peigneur. At the same time, oil companies knew that petroleum pools against the flanks of salt domes. The salt is impermeable. Nothing passes through it. So oil and gas get trapped in the surrounding rock like water backing up against a dam. Which meant Texaco wanted to drill right next to the same formation that Diamond Crystal was hollowing out from the inside. Two massive industries, operating in the same vertical column of earth, separated by a margin of error that was practically zero. The morning of November 20th, the Wilson Brothers crew, subcontracted by Texaco, started their 14-inch bit downward through the lake bed. Their target was the oil-bearing rock on the outer edge of the dome. They had coordinates. They had maps. The maps were wrong. The engineer who plotted the drill site used a coordinate system called Universal Transverse Mercator, UTM. But the reference data for the mine's boundaries was based on a different projection, Standard Transverse Mercator. These two systems project the curved surface of the Earth onto flat maps using different mathematics. Plug numbers from one system into the other without converting them, and every point shifts. Not by miles, by enough. The rig wasn't positioned over the flank of the dome, it was positioned directly above an active tunnel of the Diamond Crystal mine. No certified land surveyor verified the location. No secondary check caught the mismatch. At roughly 9 in the morning, the bit seized at 1,230 feet. The crew spent the next 2.5 hours trying to work it loose, rocking the drill string back and forth, completely unaware that they had just punched a hole through the ceiling of a salt mine and opened a direct pipeline between 3.5 billion gallons of fresh water and a structure made of the one material on Earth that fresh water destroys on contact. 1,500 feet underground, an electrician named Junius Gaddison heard something that didn't belong. A deep, percussive popping. Then the metallic banging of 55-gallon fuel drums slamming against tunnel walls. He moved toward the sound and found muddy water, knee-deep and rising, rushing through corridors that had been bone dry for 60 years. Liquid mud inside a sealed salt mine. That's physically impossible unless the mine isn't sealed anymore. Gaddison didn't wait for confirmation. He didn't radio management. He triggered the emergency lighting system. 3 rapid flashes. The universal signal for total immediate evacuation. Every miner in that complex knew what 3 flashes meant. Drop everything. Move. But the mine was enormous. Miles of tunnels spread across multiple levels. Crews working in the deepest, most remote sections couldn't see the flashing lights. A maintenance foreman named Randy LaSalle understood the geometry of the problem instantly. Instead of heading for the elevator and his own survival, LaSalle climbed onto a diesel-powered minecart and drove back into the collapsing mine. He pushed deeper, toward the flooding, navigating tunnels where the water was rising and the ceiling was groaning, to physically reach isolated crews and drag them toward the exit. Every miner in that facility had one way out, a single elevator shaft. Capacity, 8 people per trip, 55 men, 8 at a time, 1,500 feet straight up. They queued, no shoving, no panic. They stood in rising water and waited their turn while the ceiling dissolved above them. Trip after trip after trip, the elevator climbed, the shaft held, the cables held, and every single person made it to the surface. 0 casualties, not one. Up top, the lake was dying. The 14-inch puncture had become a dissolution engine. As fresh water hit the salt walls of the mine, it dissolved them. The hole widened. More water poured in. The wider it got, the faster it dissolved, the faster it grew. A self-accelerating feedback loop with no off switch. The structural pillars holding up the mine's ceilings melted like sugar cubes in a rainstorm. As each pillar failed, the roof collapsed, exposing more salt to more water, widening the breach further. The drilling crew felt the platform tilt. They heard cracking sounds rising from beneath the water. 7 men scrambled off the rig and sprinted 300 yards to shore. Minutes later, the entire 150-foot structure, $5 million of steel, tipped over and disappeared beneath the surface of a lake that was supposedly 10 feet deep. Then the whirlpool formed, a 1/4 mile in diameter, the largest man-made vortex ever recorded. 3.5 billion gallons, enough to fill more than 5,000 Olympic swimming pools, spiraling into a hole that had started at 14 inches and was now swallowing the earth itself. The suction pulled 11 loaded cargo barges off their moorings and dragged them underwater. A tugboat went down with them. 65 acres of live oak gardens, a sprawling botanical estate built over decades by a man named Jack Bales Jr., filled with tropical plants and manicured landscapes, broke apart and slid into the vortex. Trees, greenhouses, a portion of a house, all of it consumed. The Del Cambre Canal, a 12-mile waterway connecting the lake to the Gulf of Mexico, had always flowed south, draining the lake toward Vermilion Bay. Now the flow reversed. The vacuum was so powerful, it dragged salt water from the Gulf of Mexico backward through the canal, uphill, and into the crater. When that ocean water poured over the edge of the newly formed cliff, it created a 164-foot waterfall, the tallest in Louisiana's history, born in a single afternoon from an engineering mistake. Meanwhile, the millions of cubic feet of air that had filled the mine's cavernous tunnels had nowhere to go. As water crushed inward, it compressed that air like a piston. The pressure built until it found the path of least resistance, the mine's surface access shafts, and exploded upward. 400-foot geysers of mud, salt, and compressed air erupted into the sky. By 5 o'clock that evening, Lake Peigneur was empty, a muddy crater where a lake had been that morning. Then, slowly, the Gulf kept coming. Salt water continued pouring through the reverse canal, filling the void. Over the following days, the geology stabilized. The crater filled, and 9 of the 11 sunken barges, pressurized by the equilibrating water, popped back to the surface like corks, bobbing on a lake that no longer resembled anything it had been 24 hours earlier. When the Mine Safety and Health Administration launched its investigation, they hit an impossible wall. The drill rig, the drill bit, the borehole, the mechanical telemetry, every piece of physical evidence that could have definitively proven the coordinate error was buried under thousands of tons of collapsed sediment, pulverized salt, and the wreckage of 11 barges at the bottom of a flooded mine. The MSHA published its report in 1981, but was forced to stop short of assigning an official cause. The proof was entombed. The legal battle was massive. Texaco blamed Diamond Crystal for providing inaccurate mine maps. Diamond Crystal blamed Texaco and Wilson Brothers for the coordinate projection error. The weight of circumstantial evidence, the UTM versus transverse Mercator mismatch, ultimately forced settlements. Texaco and Wilson Brothers paid approximately $32 to $45 million to Diamond Crystal for the permanent destruction of the mine and another $12.8 million to the Live Oak Gardens Foundation. And the hundreds of salt miners who lost their jobs overnight? They weren't recognized as primary plaintiffs. They absorbed the economic devastation of Iberia Parish with almost nothing. The mine was officially closed in December 1986. The site was considered a permanent industrial graveyard, a monument to what happens when you drill blind into the earth. For 8 years, nobody touched it. Then AGL Resources showed up and proposed something that sounded insane. They wanted to pump billions of cubic feet of combustible natural gas into the same salt dome that had just collapsed so violently it reversed the Gulf of Mexico. The public reaction was exactly what you'd expect. A grassroots organization called Save Lake Peigneur, Peigneur formed almost immediately. Residents within a mile of the site raised alarms about groundwater contamination, specifically the Chico Aquifer, the region's primary freshwater source. The state governor temporarily halted the permitting process. During regulatory audits, it was discovered that AGL's mineral lease for the expansion area had actually expired because someone failed to pay the 2005 lease rental on time. The company was forced into protracted legal battles just to prove they had the right to be there. But AGL's engineers saw something the public couldn't. The 1980 disaster had destroyed the upper sections of the mine. But salt domes are massive. The Jefferson Island Formation extends thousands of feet in every direction. The engineers hypothesized that the peripheral unbreached sectors of the dome, sections that had never been mined and never been touched by the flooding, remained perfectly intact. They deployed three-dimensional seismic imaging and advanced sonar through narrow boreholes to map the dome's internal structure. They had to prove, definitively, that the surviving salt was completely isolated from the flooded ruins. That no fracture connected the old disaster zone to the areas they planned to use. The surveys confirmed it. Massive sections of solid virgin halite remained structurally sound. And salt, the same property that made it so catastrophically vulnerable to freshwater, also made it the most secure natural gas container on the planet. Halite is impermeable. Gas cannot pass through it. And under the immense pressure of the surrounding earth, salt behaves plastically. It flows like an incredibly thick liquid, slowly closing microfractures and sealing itself. A salt cavern doesn't just hold gas, it heals. To build the storage facility, engineers used a controlled version of the exact process that destroyed the original mine. They drilled precision wells into the solid salt and pumped pressurized freshwater into targeted sections, dissolving the halite along carefully calculated geometric parameters. The saturated brine was extracted continuously, carving out smooth, teardrop-shaped caverns designed specifically to hold pressurized gas. Flow rates had to be controlled with extreme precision, too fast, and the cavern walls would become irregular, creating structural weak points. Too slow, and the project timeline and budget would spiral. Once the caverns were carved, engineers replaced the brine with natural gas, injecting it under enormous pressure. A permanent base layer of gas, called cushion gas, had to remain in each cavern at all times to maintain minimum pressure and prevent the walls from collapsing inward under the weight of the earth above. The facility was then connected to the surface through miles of heavy-gauge pipeline, compressor stations, and dehydration units, all feeding directly into the Sabine pipeline and onward to the Henry Hub, the single most important pricing point for natural gas futures in North America. But the earth never stops pushing. Salt creep, the slow, relentless inward deformation of the cavern walls under lithostatic pressure, is a constant threat. Left unmanaged, the caverns would gradually shrink, losing capacity and potentially compromising structural integrity. Federal regulators required continuous sonar monitoring, mapping the cavern's dimensions at regular intervals to catch any deformation before it became dangerous. Stand on the shore of Lake Peigneur today, and you're looking at a place that has been completely reinvented, twice. Where there was once a 10-foot deep freshwater fishing lake, there is now a 200-foot deep saltwater body, the deepest lake in Louisiana. The freshwater ecosystem that existed for centuries is gone, replaced by a brackish marine environment that established itself after the Gulf of Mexico permanently refilled the crater. A lone brick chimney and fireplace jut from the water's surface near the old shoreline. The last visible remnant of Jack Bales Jr.'s botanical estate, swallowed whole in a single afternoon. Beneath that surface, the Jefferson Island Storage and Hub holds 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas storage capacity, with 7 billion cubic feet of working gas actively cycling through the system. That's enough energy to heat roughly 70,000 homes for an entire year. The facility connects directly to 8 major interstate pipelines, with primary access to the Henry Hub through the Sabine Pipeline, placing a former disaster zone at the beating heart of North America's energy distribution network. And then there's the discovery nobody expected. In 1987, a microbiologist named Russell Vreeland descended into the flooded lower levels of the mine, where the water had reached 32% salinity, 9 times saltier than seawater. He wasn't looking for energy, he was looking for life. The catastrophic dissolution of those Jurassic-era salt pillars had cracked open crystals that had been sealed for over 100 million years. Inside, Vreeland found bacteria, ancient extremophile organisms that had been suspended in a state of biological stasis since the age of the dinosaurs. He revived them, living organisms, older than flowering plants, awakened by an industrial accident. That research became a foundational model for astrobiologists studying whether ancient life might be preserved in salt deposits on Mars. The reason all of this worked here, the survival, the storage facility, the science, comes down to one material: halite. The same salt that dissolved so catastrophically when fresh water touched it also possesses the 2 properties that made everything else possible. It's impermeable, meaning gas can't escape through it, and it's plastic, meaning it slowly flows and self-heals under pressure. The 1980 disaster destroyed the upper mine, but the adjacent, unbreached sections of the dome remained perfectly sealed. A geological firewall that no other rock type on Earth could have provided. Build this facility in sandstone, and the gas leaks. Build it in shale, and the fractures spread. Attempt it in a depleted conventional reservoir, and you're fighting slow injection rates and fundamental containment problems for the life of the project. Only salt could survive its own catastrophe and still function as a pressure vessel. The miners survived because salt dissolved slowly enough to give you a window, 2.5 hours between the first trickle and the final collapse. Long enough for Junius Gaddison to hear the warning. Long enough for Randy LaSalle to drive back into the dark. Long enough for 55 men to ride an 8-person elevator to the surface, one agonizing trip at a time. A 14-inch drill bit, a misread map, and 3.5 billion gallons of fresh water turned a quiet Louisiana lake into the largest man-made whirlpool ever recorded. It destroyed a mine, swallowed a botanical garden, reversed a canal, and created a waterfall taller than Niagara. And then engineers came back, walked up to the same geology that had just collapsed so violently it rearranged the coastline, and said, "We can use this." The thing that failed became the thing that worked, not despite the disaster, but because the same material properties that made the collapse possible also made the resurrection possible. That's not irony. That's engineering. Here's what I want to know. If you were a regulator in Louisiana and AGL Resources came to you with a proposal to pump explosive gas into a salt dome that had just collapsed and swallowed an entire lake, would you have signed off? Or would the history of that site have been enough to kill the project permanently? Drop your answer in the comments. And if stories about engineering that operates right on the edge between catastrophe and genius are the kind of thing that keeps you watching, subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from.